where we left off, all right, the German army has invaded Poland, and then from there we have this phony war, Sitzkrieg period, where there's not much happening. Germany is not being invaded by France and Britain, despite the fact that they've declared war on Germany. Germany then jumps into Denmark, so they can have a staging point to get into Scandinavia, Norway. Then the Low Countries, then France falls. Now Britain is alone. And Germany plans the invasion of Great Britain in what they call Operation, anybody recall? Sea Lion, very good. That's got to start with the Battle of Britain because the Germans need to gain air superiority before they can have their amphibious invasion. The Battle of Britain is a defeat for Germany, their first defeat in the Second World War. And with the defeat at the Battle of Britain, that invasion can never take place. So Germany then turns its eyes to the east, and they are going to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941 in what is called Operation Barbarossa. What's the United States up to during this whole time? That's where we're going to go back to today. We recall in the late 1930s, the United States had adopted a policy of neutrality towards any European conflict that might come along. And the United States had signed into law a number of neutrality acts that were meant to keep the United States from getting involved in any European conflict. Remembering that in World War I, according to that Nye Committee report, in World War I, the United States was dragged into the war, not just because of the Zimmerman telegram, and not just because of the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, but because there were millions of dollars in loans to Britain, and far fewer out to Germany. And that gave the United States a vested interest to want Britain to win the war, which, according to the Nye Committee report, gave us enough reason to join the war on the British side. So these neutrality acts are going to start with and continue a progressive series of keeping us further and further removed from European conflict. All right? I would not require you guys to remember what the first and the second and the third and the fourth neutrality acts specifically did. But what I would assume you can do is to lump them all together and say that those four neutrality acts progressively made the United States stay further and further away from entering any conflict. Going from we will not make loans to countries at war, to we will not ship arms to countries at war, we will not ship anything to countries at war unless they pay cash and they carry it themselves. All right, getting progressively more neutral as we go along. Well, now we have war in Europe. After September 1st, 1939, we've got war in Europe. Does that change the Americas' tune? Not really. While President Roosevelt is certainly supportive of the United Kingdom and he wants to see an end to Nazi aggression and Japanese aggression in Asia, the American public is still fiercely neutral and fiercely non-interventionist, which means stay out of European affairs. And because the American public is fiercely neutral, the American Congress, who elects those, or who's elected by the American public, they are neutral as well. 2 days after the war breaks out, so 2 days after September 3rd, when war is officially declared by Britain and France, 2 days after war breaks out, the United States will again pronounce their neutrality. And President Roosevelt will prohibit the sale of any arms to any belligerent nation. We are staying out of it, because that's what the political climate of the time says. In October of 1939, there will be another Pan-American conference. And here, the United States, along with our Latin American friends, remember the good neighbor policy? We've got pretty good relationships with them. And we all have made a proclamation of neutrality to this point. We will, with our Latin American friends, agree to the creation of what's called the Hemisphere Neutrality Belt. The Hemisphere Neutrality Belt. And think of it as a 300-mile buffer, a bubble around the United States and Latin America and South America. And that we are telling the belligerent nations, Germany and the UK and the rest, and Japan and the Pacific, stay out of our Hemisphere Neutrality Belt. This is where you can't go bringing your war. You want to bring your war to 301 miles away? Fine. Do what you need to do. But 300 miles, we're keeping an eye on that. And so you bring the war to there, that might make us not so neutral anymore. Roosevelt, however, despite this, Roosevelt still, in his mind and in his heart, is on Team United Kingdom. He would like to support Winston Churchill. It is just not politically feasible for him to do so at this point. All right? What does Roosevelt have to think of a year down the road? A 1940 election, right? So that's got to be in the back of his mind, as does every member of Congress and as does a third of the U.S. Senate. Wait a minute. Why only a third of the U.S. Senate? Huh? They move out in thirds because their terms of office are every 6 years, so every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. So they've got to be considering this. So Roosevelt is still having secret communications, these aren't public, secret communications with Churchill about how American involvement might change in the future, how America might become more supportive to the British fight. In November of 1939, the United States makes a pretty major step in becoming more supportive to the British, with a 5th Neutrality Act being passed. Of all of the Neutrality Acts and all the specific parameters of them, the 5th Neutrality Act is probably the one to most remember in November of 1939. This is the Cash and Carry Arms Neutrality Act. Remember, earlier we had a cash and carry provision, but that was for non-weapons. That was for any other goods that we might sell to anybody. You had to pay cash for them, and you had to carry them in your own ships. Now we are allowing President Roosevelt with the 5th Neutrality Act. The president can now decide to whom and what we could sell to any belligerent. So President Roosevelt can decide to open up arms sales to England, for example. But it's under a cash and carry provision, so long as England paid cash, because we're not going to get indebted with loans here, or we're not going to give out a bunch of credit here. They have to pay in cash, and the Brits have to carry it on their own ships. Also, the United States is going to start using our own Air Force to fly over the Western Atlantic off the east coast of the United States to see if we see any German ships. And if we do see any German activity, we report that to Britain. So we're still neutral in the war. We're not joining a side, but we're not really as neutral as we used to be. We are picking sides here. We're not putting boots on the ground yet, but we are absolutely picking sides. Evan, sir? Basically, yeah. Well, we are using our planes to fly over the Western Atlantic to make sure everything is cool. And if we see any information that the British might like positions of German Navy, we let them know. We're not officially being spies or anything like that for the British, but we are flying our own self-defense operations and passing on information to the Brits. Amira?
So as part of the Fifth Neutrality Act, wasn't like the whole London
We're going to get to there in a second. That's not a part of this. Yes, sir.
So you said the U.S. wanted Britain to win because they had millions of dollars.
That was back in World War I. That was World War I, and that's why all of the Neutrality Acts before this said we aren't going to loan money because that's what gets us dragged into a war we don't want to be in. So that's why we're doing these cash and carry. You got to pay cash. We're not loaning you money, right? We are in 1939, like the question is, why is Roosevelt or why are any Americans siding with Britain rather than Germany? Because Germany and Nazism and totalitarianism, they don't sit well with our mindset of how America thinks people should live their lives, right? We're all about liberty and democracy and having people be able to choose who their representatives and who their leaders are. And obviously, Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany don't follow that line. And down the road, Franklin Roosevelt has these visions of a world that is free and democratic and has open borders where people can trade, with the idea being if goods are making their way back and forth across open borders, soldiers won't be going back and forth over those borders, right? If countries trade with each other, if countries have positive relations with each other, then there'll be less war in the future. So that's why we're on Team Britain in this case. We also, at the same time, are beginning a rearmament process. Ever since World War I, the United States has been a disarmed nation because we don't need many arms, right? We have 2 oceans protecting us on either border, on either coast. We've got neighbors to the north and south who are not military threats to the United States. We don't need much of a military. But by the time we get to the mid-1930s and certainly the late 1930s, when things really get hot and heavy in Europe, the United States is going to start accelerating a rearmament process. Do you guys remember, it was vaguely mentioned probably last year to you and maybe in this past couple weeks, in 1921 there was a meeting in Washington, D.C. of the great naval powers of the world called the Washington Naval Conference. And that established the amounts of battleships, for example, that various navies could have. And so it created like, you can't have more battleships than this, America and Britain and France and Germany and Japan. This is your limit. We had never even gotten to our limit according to the 1921 agreement. We were never even that big. We were still allowed to grow our Navy larger than we had. Okay? So in the mid-1930s, in the midst of a Great Depression, in the midst of increasing tensions around the world, Franklin Roosevelt pushed for an increase in military spending to start building up especially our Navy. And what's another side effect of building up a Navy in the mid-1930s for the United States? The economy. Building these ships, that's a lot of workers, right? Putting guys to work, federal government using its resources, its dollars to employ Americans. That was most of what Franklin Roosevelt was all about, right? Using federal dollars to spur employment in the United States. As the war breaks out in Europe, we accelerate our military spending, all right? We also want to talk about public opinion in the United States and how there's quite a variance. Even though we talked about how in the 1930s most Americans don't want to get involved in a European war. That is absolutely true. But as we press into the actual years of the European war, more and more Americans are going to start to see getting involved as something that America not only should do, but maybe has to do. And again, who is this? The drawing looks familiar, right? Yeah, it's so easy to see his, and his cartoons are like ubiquitous. If you Google World War II cartoons, most of what's going to pop up is probably Dr. Seuss's work. So we've got Dr. Seuss here, and can you take a look at this and tell me what he might think about United States' continued neutrality in the face of a European war? I'm not understanding. Is he pro-neutrality, or does he want to intervene? He wants to intervene. Because we have the old man, and what do old men kind of symbolize maybe in cartoons? Maybe conservative, stubborn, not willing to move, possibly. The old man kind of thumbing his nose to what's going on in the rest of the world. You know, he's not making eye, he's got his eyes shut even, it appears. He's got this long beard, and of course, we always, when we're looking at political cartoons, we want to take a look at whatever words are written anywhere. It says Neutrality Act. Okay, so obviously we have a series of neutrality acts. And we've got his long beard tied to the ship, and the ship says, aid that will win. If only we could get rid of these neutrality acts, the United States could start providing aid to the Brits, and they would be able to win the war in the end. But we're holding it back. So you've got some in America, that are going to advocate, and this is going to be initially a smaller group, but it will grow, that are going to advocate the United States getting involved in this European war. This is a stamp from the Committee to Defend America, which was a political action committee that was born in 1940 that supported President Roosevelt and other politicians who wanted to intervene in the European war. Political action committees, they raise money, they give money to those candidates that believe what they believe in hopes of getting the government to do what they want it to do. So the Committee to Defend America is a committee, political action committee, put together to help fund politicians like Roosevelt who wanted to give more aid to Britain. But they, especially in 1940, are going to be dwarfed by the America First Committee. An even initially larger group, at its height, had hundreds of chapters all throughout the nation with almost 1 million paying members. The America First Committee, which here we can see, Save Our Sons, no convoys, that's no shipping to the Allied powers, no war, no death for American boys. The America First Committee wanted to stop the United States or to continue our non-interventionist policies. Now, of course, once December 7th, 1941 happens, that's the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, these guys are going to fizzle out. 3 days after the Pearl Harbor attacks, the America First Committee will dissolve. Because after we are actually attacked, there are very few Americans that are not supportive of getting involved in these foreign wars. All right? But the mere existence of these two committees shows that there is some debate that's going on, all right? And I want everybody to always remember that as we live in a time where the media likes to tell us that there's, and politicians like to tell us that there's never been a time in American history when we've been so politically divided. Which always makes me scratch my head, because every time that you study American history, you are reading about times where there are political divisions. We are a nation that fought a civil war with each other. We've had political divisions before, all right? And there certainly were in 1940-41. But of course, our government, as the war is getting more and more serious, our government, and absolutely our president, is more supportive of getting involved in the European war on the side of the British. In March of 1941, and this is important to remember because before with the 5th Neutrality Act, we were a cash and carry country. We will get stuff to Britain, or sell stuff to them, but they've got to pay cash and they've got to come pick it up. That was the 5th Neutrality Act that was passed in 1939. In March of 1941, we get a new bill that is sent along through Congress and ultimately signed by the President, called the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act. And you notice, since this is in March of 1941, President Roosevelt already won his election. Right? Yes, sir? Yeah.
That's before the Soviet Union invaded.
Yep. Yeah, don't worry. This is obviously going to come later. The original Lend-Lease Act was United States, Britain, and China. But eventually, as soon as the Soviet Union is invaded...
But I mean the cartoon is later than the actual thing.
The Dr. Seuss cartoon?
Yeah, no, that one right there.
Oh, this one? Yeah, this is going to come after March of 1941. Absolutely. So, by March of 1941, what has President Roosevelt already done in November of 1940? He's already been reelected to his 3rd term. He doesn't have to run again until November of 1944. And what has every member of Congress already done by March of 1941? They've won their re-elections or they've been elected. There's not another congressional election until November of 1942, so more than a year and a half down the road. So now it's pretty politically safe for a new bill to be passed, which is going to turn back a lot of what was done with the earlier Neutrality Acts. And that's the Lend-Lease Act, Lend-Lease Act. Yes, ma'am?
So I have a question, just like about presidency in general. Like, if you get reelected, then do you really have a lame duck period?
If you get reelected, we don't really consider it a lame duck period. No, because you're still in office and you're going to be in office going forward. We really only consider it a lame duck when you either don't get reelected and you're riding out your term, or you've had your 2 terms and you're just done. So, yeah, if you're still going to be in office, you're not a lame duck. And in a sense, lame duck lame means like can't fly, right? Can't really do what it's meant to do. So the lame duck presidency is, it doesn't really have, it's got the same constitutional powers, but not a whole lot is done during those months. All right, so the Lend-Lease Act, March of 1941, the United States is going to agree to give military aid initially to Britain and to China. This is before communist China, right? Initially to Britain and China, later to the Soviet Union once they're invaded in June of 41, in exchange for leasing rights on some naval bases around the world. All right? So we are going to loan money in exchange for basing rights. Through the course of the war, through the course of the Lend-Lease Act, the United States will dole out more than $50 billion in military aid, most of which will never be paid back because we got these leasing rights. Any semblance of the United States being a neutral party in this war is now over. We are actively engaged in arming all of the Allied powers. We're not fighting the war yet, but we're engaged in arming them at least. March of 41. And so in June of 41, once the Soviet Union is attacked, we start opening up aid to them. Yes, ma'am? We did. President Roosevelt did open up aid to China very early on. Yep. Because that was, he could get around the Neutrality Act there because when the Japanese invaded mainland China, they never officially declared war. So Roosevelt used that as a loophole. Good question. All right, next step in getting the United States further entrenched in the war is a meeting between President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill on a ship off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, where those two will sign what's called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter is a statement of shared principles, a statement of beliefs by the British and the Americans about what this war is all about. To whom do you think it is crucially important that they understand what this war is really all about? What people? The people who don't want to go to war, the American people, right? The British people already know that this war is worth fighting, right? They've already been bombed. The London Blitz has already happened. So they know all about that. They've got to convince the Americans to get involved. So the Atlantic Charter is going to be, even before the United States joins the war, Roosevelt is going to meet with Churchill, and they're going to come up with an agreement that's known as the Atlantic Charter that states the beliefs about what this war is all about, so Roosevelt can then do what? Work on convincing the American people that this is a worthwhile endeavor. So here's what the Atlantic Charter is going to say. And there should be some bells going off in your ears as to why these things are being said. All right? Number one, this war will not be fought for territorial gain. No territorial gain in this war. Why is that in the Atlantic Charter? Yusuf.
Because it's sort of like World War I with the Ninth Committee. They want to prove that it's not for economic gain.
Okay, very, very good. In World War I, the war with the Ninth Committee certainly talks about economic gain that the United States could have had if we were on the winning side of the war. But also, what happened at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I? Germany was carved up, right? Germany was carved up. All of German colonies were dished off to the victorious powers in the form of League of Nations mandates. German territory itself was given to all of its neighbors. What American would support going to a war and having American boys die so the British Empire can become stronger, right? Or so France can become larger? We wouldn't support that. So this war will not be about territorial gain. We will also support the idea of self-determination of all peoples of the world. Let people determine for themselves how they want to be ruled. Who do you think that was tough for, Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt? Why would that be tougher for Churchill? Britain's got an empire, right? Recall that Woodrow Wilson, back in his 14 points, wanted people of the world to enjoy self-determination. But Wilson sacrificed that idea in order to get the League of Nations created. In 1941, Franklin Roosevelt will not sacrifice that idea. And in 1941, Britain has to be willing to sacrifice their empire, right? This is Britain being willing to give up at least part of their empire in order to keep their state, keep their nation, right? Because think of the difference between what's going on in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference versus what's going on in 1941. In 1919, the war is over. Does Britain need the United States anymore? Nope. They're going to keep their empire. In 1941, the war is just beginning. Britain absolutely needs the United States. So Winston Churchill has to make this concession. And it shouldn't surprise you that after World War II, within a couple years, Britain is out of India. Britain is out of the Middle East. Britain is going to, within the next 20 years, get out of most of Africa. All right? Restoration of self-government. All of those places that the Japanese or the Germans have already conquered, we're going to return their own governments to them. A reduction of trade barriers, with the idea that when there is free trade, when there are goods that are crossing borders, armies won't be crossing borders. When countries are in business with each other, they won't be at war with each other. Also making it a goal of global cooperation. The beginning seeds of what will one day become the United Nations are born with the Atlantic Charter, creating a new international organization that can do what the League of Nations was not able to do. Because namely, who's going to be in the next major international organization? We are. We stayed out of the League of Nations. We won't anymore. And finally, the disarmament of aggressor nations. A lot of things going on there with the Atlantic Charter, but essentially it is the United States president telling the American people what this war would be all about if we were going to get involved in it. And as the war presses on, with the Atlantic Charter now being drafted, more and more Americans are going to start switching sides to being pro-interventionist. Yes?
When you said disarmament of aggressor nations, meaning...
Japan and Germany, like, take away their arms. Don't take away their territory. Don't take away their land. Take away their arms, their weapons. This is like the real beginning of the United States and the UK forming a military relationship with each other. Emily and then Kevin. This is in August of 1941. Kevin.
Were the aggressor nation and self-determination things supposed to apply to the Soviets at all?
That is a great question. This is a great question because in August of 1941, we absolutely know about what the Soviet Union has been up to in the previous years. But in August of 1941, the Soviet Union has now been attacked by Germany. The Soviet Union is an ally of Britain's now. We are funding the Soviet Union. Kevin notices a contradiction here, right? And keep that in the back of your mind as we get to the end of World War II. The question of, wait a minute, isn't the Soviet Union an aggressive nation as well? But the realities of 1941 dictate overlooking those things. And the reality of 1945 you'll see, dictate overlooking some of those things. All right, everybody good? December 7th, 1941, that is a date you should all be familiar with. That's the date that the Japanese attack us at Pearl Harbor. Yes, ma'am?
So the Lend-Lease Act, okay, so it came first and then was the Atlantic Charter.
Yep.
And then...
Yep. So Lend-Lease Act, we're going to start giving more military aid, then the Atlantic Charter, the Statement of Principles about what the war is about, and now in December of 1941, the Pearl Harbor attack. On December 8th, this is when Franklin Roosevelt gets before a joint session of Congress to give a speech, and he says that on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the United States in a date. It's a date that which will live in infamy. Pardon me, I butchered that. That's why I am not a president. I'm finally old enough to be one, though, but I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm going to keep teaching. Don't worry. So the United States declares war on Japan. Within a couple more days, Germany declares war on the United States. We are now official military allies of Britain and the Soviet Union. One last note on this topic. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so just to clarify, at this point is Italy in the war?
Italy is absolutely in the war. Italy is fighting their own war. We're going to talk about them in just 2 minutes. Yes.
So what was the main reason why Japan attacked the U.S.?
We're going to have that on a whole day devoted to just Japan and the United States. But let's leave it right now at the United States was not happy with Japanese invasion of China. And so we had placed a series of embargoes on Japan by 1941, we are limiting oil shipments and steel shipments. We're eliminating no oil shipments and steel shipments. So Japan attacked us in hopes of so crippling us that we would never be able to fight Japan, and maybe they could force us into reopening those arms shipments. Yes?
And then why was Germany going against the U.S. only because?
That's a great question. What's that? It is. That's a good question. We're going to deal with that more on another day as well, but let me just answer that question really quickly. Why does Germany, of all of the treaties that Adolf Hitler had violated, why does he stick with this one, what's called the tripartite pact between Italy, Germany, and Japan? Why does he do that? And ultimately, by this point in the war, Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, I don't have a map available for you right here, but if we think of the world, Germany is attacking the Soviet Union in the west. What's on the east of the Soviet Union? Japan. Germany has hopes that Japan will start causing the Soviet Union fits in the east, essentially creating a two-front war for the Soviets to fight. That never really comes to fruition for Germany, but that was his ultimate hope, is that he would have the Japanese aiding his fight in the east. Yes, ma'am?
But wasn't the Tripartite Act, like, it only applied if one of those three countries was attacked?
Exactly. It was a defensive alliance.
Did they turn it into an offensive one?
When the United States declared war on Japan, because we did declare war on Japan. We made our own declaration. Sure. I mean, but he knows the writings. He knows what happened. And, he did not have to necessarily follow that agreement, but he will in hopes of gaining Japanese support in Asia against the Soviets. Yes? What a good question. What is Spain doing? Not much of anything. Spain is a neutral power in the Second World War. Remember me briefly mentioning they had their own civil war? The outcome of their civil war was the victory of a fascist government in Spain, which means that Adolf Hitler didn't feel that Spain was really, they didn't have to go and invade and take over Spain. Kind of had a friendly ally in Spain. But Spain officially stays neutral in the war. Yes?
Spain supplies a lot of volunteers on the Eastern Front, and it gives Germany iron, but other than that, they stay neutral.
Yeah. All right. So we press on. There's one more thing to bring up on this new relationship between Britain and the United States, and that's a meeting that spans December to January 41 to 42. Oh, can I call a quick timeout really quick? Well, every quick timeout would be really quick, I guess. I'm going to call a quick timeout, just 30-second timeout here. As history students, sometimes we can get bogged down in the years. Like we're going through this so quickly. 1939 all of a sudden becomes 1940, becomes 1941. And we talk about it literally within minutes. We want to remember and slow ourselves down a little bit to recognize that even 2 years' time, when these kinds of events are happening, is a long time. I like to, for myself, think about what I was doing 2 years ago to kind of wrap my head around it, or it's even probably better for you guys. So if right now is when the Pearl Harbor attack happened, 2 years and 3 months before now would be when the war started. So if right now is Pearl Harbor, World War II officially starts when you guys are in the beginning of your sophomore year. Think of how much has happened and how much you've gone through in just those 2 quick years, okay? And I think that can make it a lot easier to grasp the time spans that these wars are taking place. Or, for example, the 6 years that World War II ultimately lasts until 1945. Well, we're going to talk about that in a matter of weeks, but 6 years for your lives, you're a completely different person, you know? You guys have really, really done some changes. Anyway, December to January 41 to 42. A meeting in Washington, D.C. known as the Washington Conference. Not to be confused with the 1921 Washington Naval Conference. This is just the Washington Conference. A meeting between the United States and Great Britain, between Churchill and Roosevelt and their top generals, to coordinate their war plans. And there are a few really important ideas that come out of this conference. Yes?
Is that where Germany first comes out of? Is that where that idea? Yep, absolutely. So coordinating war plans, a number of important ideas coming out of this. First, the
The United States agrees that our primary military effort, our first concern, is going to be defeat Nazi Germany. This is called our Europe First strategy, to defeat Nazi Germany. Why might that ruffle some American feathers? Yeah, Evan. We were attacked by Japan. Why focus on Germany first? Anyone want to give a reason why we focus on Germany first? Germany does not control Japan, but they do have an alliance with each other, but they are their own individual countries. Good thought. Germany at the time seemed to be a greater threat to the Allies in general, right? What separates, for example, England from Germany? A narrow English Channel. What separates the United States from Japan? A Pacific Ocean, okay? Yes, the Japanese have now struck us at Pearl Harbor, but there's still a massive amount of space between us and Japan being a true threat to the United States homeland, all right? So it was seen that if we coordinated our primary efforts in Europe, we could defeat the Nazis and then get whose help down the road in defeating Japan? Britain and the Soviet Union, right? So defeat Nazis first, Europe first. That comes out of the Washington Conference. 2, it is agreed that all Allied forces will be working under a single command. So World War II will truly be an international war in the sense that American generals will be commanding American troops and British troops and Canadian troops and French troops. We will be commanding troops from many countries, all of the Allies. Yes? Well, yeah, and at times, you know, there might be British generals that could be in charge of various nations' troops as well. So there would be a unified command. Remember, one of the problems that the British and the French and the Belgians had at the outset of the war is there was no unified command. Brits were leading Brits, Frenchmen were leading French, Belgians were leading Belgians, and there was no Belgians. There was no coordinated strategy amongst them. Now we have that. It was also agreed that the first attack in the war, the first Allied attack in the war, would be in North Africa. We'll talk about that more in a couple minutes. First Allied attack in the war is going to be in North Africa. And finally, it was agreed at this conference that there would be no separate peace. No separate peace. Which means, if we are an ally with the UK, neither the UK or the United States would be allowed to enter into their own peace agreement separately with Germany. We're standing together until the end. What do you think is in their memory? What do you think is in British memory that worked this into the Washington Conference? Darshall. Okay, hold on to that 1 second.
When Russia left after its revolution.
Very good. When Russia in 1918 signs a separate peace with Germany, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, do we recall that? Which left the other allies hanging on their own. That won't happen anymore. No separate peace. When Germany is ready to surrender, the war is over. Britain can't leave first. America can't leave first. Everybody cool on that? No separate peace. And finally, that we would all put our full effort towards this war. We couldn't do this war halfway. The United States and the United Kingdom had to completely mobilize for war to achieve that victory. Okay? Everybody had to devote all of their energy towards this war. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes, ma'am.
When is like the depression? Is it like during this season?
The Depression is ending now. And one of the biggest reasons that economists now look back to see the end of the Depression is the United States, and we'll talk about this at a later date, the United States is going to be able to return to like full employment for the first time since the beginning of the Great Depression, because we're going to start doing all this military spending and selling arms to our allies. All right. I'm going to give it a quick break.